Yeah, because if you experienced a period of peace and prosperity under man's law by embracing that choice, I promise you it was temporary, it was short-lived, and it's over now. So if it was ever doing you any good in the past, open your eyes. Them days are over. It was simply temporary to get you to where you are now. And it's going to be very, very difficult, if it's even possible, to get out of the situation that we are now, which means we should have learned in the first place never to let it come to this, because once you get into this situation, you may never be able to get yourself out of it.
Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Today it's going to be a very interesting show. I have a very interesting guest, which I'm really glad to have him been able to get here on my podcast. Welcome, Douglas Martin. Welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me on, Francisco. It's really great to be here. I've been looking forward to having a talk with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, we're going to cover quite a few interesting topics, and that it might even get a little bit complex at times. But I think these are, these topics are of great importance, and I think we should, get into it and discuss them. Shed some light on on quite a few things. I don't know, Douglas, can you like give a little bit of an introduction, about yourself and who you are, your work?
Sure. I've been studying at my own leisure here for quite a while now, probably in excess of 10 years. And I got a little bit, into the conspiracy bent back in, before 2010. And I started listening to Alex Jones, and I kind of exhausted that political paradigm rhetoric and wanted to take it farther. From there, I kind of went into Santos Bonacci's work and got into some astrotheology. And I still wasn't satisfied, so I wanted to go a little further than that, and I kept digging. Ultimately, I found David Whitehead was hosting Bonacci's show when Bonacci was making his movie, and he brought Mark Passio on as one of the last shows as a guest, and that's where I was introduced to Mark Passio. Then I began studying Mark Passio's work, and I went deep into Mark's work, and when I finally started to get a handle on that, I started to run down some of the authors that he had introduced me to, particularly regarding anthropology. And the one author that stood out the most to me was Albert Churchward. And of course, a lot of that's based on Gerald Massey. So I went pretty deep into the Churchward. But really, it really kind of all started for me when I saw the movie Apocalypse Now, to be honest with you. And I kind of fleshed out Kurtz's library and started running down those books in Kurtz's library, one of which was Ritual to Romance by Jesse L. Weston. And of course, The Golden Bough is the supporting research for that. And that's also in Kurtz's library. So that's kind of what compelled me to take me into the anthropology, which kind of takes you straight into the study of Arthurian legend. And of course, history is a big part of that study. So trying to understand the Dark Age really does require a great deal of understanding of the anthropology, because and that's what the Arthurian legend is really. It's really the category that it falls into, to really understand it. And should try to put a definition on what anthropology really is it's the study of human behavior. So I'm interested in all things that affect human behavior, particularly anything that destroys freedom. So I'm interested in all of the psychology that leads up to the destruction of freedom, and I'm interested in all of the things that drive human behavior that leads to the destruction of human freedom, if that helps.
Oh yeah, and I guess this type of information, while it's true that you can find it, it's not, let's say, that this readily available and to the general public, and that's kind of why why there's so much, ignorance about it, I guess. And that's kind of, and that goes into the various mechanisms that can relate to pretty much the mechanisms of power, which is to take advantage of this ignorance, and using this sort of knowledge, the knowledge about what you were talking about what drives human behavior, among other things, to actually rule and enslave people. And from here, I guess we could go into one of the things we wanted to discuss, which is the whole occult issue. Because I mean, there's a lot of misconceptions about what the occult is, and I guess it's pretty on purpose. Many people associate it with various types of things, various types of not very accurate things, like witchcraft and whatnot. But so yeah, for starters, I guess we could, if we can like go ahead and explain what the occult actually is. What is this body of knowledge, I guess?
Yeah. My experience has been that people that are still stuck in the political paradigm are people that are lacking knowledge of the occult. And they've probably ascribed to the Hollywood variant of what the occult is, or they associated that with evil. And that's actually one of the mind tricks of the dark occultist is basically dissuasion, to dissuade you from looking into the information, because part of the world of the occult is their ability to hide things in plain sight. It would be akin to being insulted in a foreign language. You wouldn't understand what was being said, and then that way you could even be being mocked without even having any knowledge of that. That's part of what the occult is. But yeah, let's try to put a definition on the occult and then work with that, because I'm sure that it's not widely known. And I'm sure that people have many misconceptions about what the term actually means. But I would define it as, well, let's look at the etymology of the word. It comes from the word oculus, which means eye, and from occultare, which is to hide or to conceal. So it's basically to hide or to conceal from the eye. So basically, let's just define that the word occult means hidden or hidden knowledge. And typically, it deals with the study of the hidden laws of nature. So the occultist is accepting a much wider worldview and is dealing with a much wider worldview than people that are unaware of it, because they're interested in the hidden laws that are operating in nature. And this is the knowledge that the ruling class does not want us to understand, because it's self-empowering. And with this knowledge, they cannot put their slavery system in place called man's law, because man's law is slavery. So part of the trick of man's law is to hide all of the information that exposes the fact that man's law is slavery. But more importantly, it's the knowledge that we really need to understand the hidden laws in nature, so we can really learn how to, exist in this domain or in this realm and be in harmony with the laws of nature. So, yeah, and there's a lot more to it. So I have a lot of points about it that I want to try to make sure I get covered. But the occult, it encompasses so much more. So first of all, what we're saying is knowledge that has been hidden is not any knowledge that could be self-empowering. Because my criteria for it could be even more vast, because I consider, like, for instance, any knowledge of the pre-Christian world would be knowledge that they want hidden. Any knowledge of what drives human behavior could be knowledge that they want hidden. But ideally, it's the knowledge of natural law that they want hidden, because they're usurping natural law with man's law. So their intention is to overthrow the laws of creation or the moral laws in nature and supplant that with man's law. In other words, man becoming God, or man overthrowing the laws of creation. And so the occult is dealing with things that drive human behavior, which I would say would be, it also deals with things that are beyond the limits of language, and also deals with pure forms of symbolism, and also forms of subversive symbolism, which are corrupted forms of pure symbolism. Deals with psychology, ancient psychology, cosmology, dark psychology, what we can call sorcery. Typically, the terms exoteric and esoteric can help us define this subject. Exoteric is a body of knowledge that's basically widely known and accepted by the general population.
Yes.
But esoteric knowledge, you have to want it. It doesn't mean it's necessarily occulted. Esoteric just means it's specialized knowledge that if the student is interested in it, he has to seek it out. So to become a doctor, for instance, you need esoteric medical information and, esoteric scholastic information, esoteric advanced curriculums in a college curriculum. That's all esoteric, but that's not necessarily occult, because the knowledge is readily available. It hasn't been deliberately hidden from sight. So when we're understanding the occult, we definitely want to keep in mind that knowledge has been hidden for benevolent reasons as well as malevolent reasons, because so it's been hidden for good reasons and for bad reasons. And there's, and that's obviously one of the obvious bad reasons is because the ruling class wants to control. That's a bad reason to hide knowledge, but a good reason to hide knowledge is to try to keep it out of the hands of somebody that might try to use it to control. So for reasons of the same, that's one reason certain things were hidden or held back in the past. And there's a lot more to it. So
I think we have to give it a little bit of context, because because in the past you could you seriously ran into the risk of being, brutally executed and tortured if the system found out that you possessed or were spreading certain knowledge. So
absolutely, you could be accused of heresy,
yes,
and then be deemed a heretic, and heresy hunting became the new sport after the Council of Nicaea. So the ambition was to obliterate all cultural traditions that predate Nicaea. So occult knowledge also consists of ancient traditions that would expose the new doctrines as dogmatic or illegitimate. Anything that would challenge the legitimacy or the integrity of religious doctrine, because religion is really what does control the world. And of course, anything that would challenge the decrees of a would-be empire or imperialist power, so all of these things are part of the occult. And yeah, that's a good example of a reason to hide knowledge. That's I'm into Harold Bailey's work now. His name and his last name is spelled Bayley, and he deals specifically a lot with the Dark Age and what happened that led up to the Renaissance, which is supposed to have happened basically in that region where you are now.
Yes.
And he shows that it had basically started in the Languedoc region of France and southwestern France. But what the Renaissance was really about has been largely obscured by modern education, and wrap that in quotes. But yeah, it has been. And my most recent presentation is dealing with that fact, about what the Renaissance was actually about, which was Eastern traditions emerging in the West in the wake of the Council of Nicaea and Rome's ambition to unite Europe under the banner of Latin Christendom. So, but the world of the occult deals with bigger picture thinking. And, part of what's in the world of the occult is knowledge that is really the source knowledge, potentially, for what all religions in the modern world were derived. Basically, becoming expert level in the occult is the same as being capable of actually starting a world religion, because you've reached a level of understanding the psychology of what drives human behavior, and then you understand the things that will influence those behaviors. And in that way, it can be used very much to forward political paradigms and political agendas. So that's one of the things about the occult we want to keep in mind, how it would be used politically as a control. Because like I say, people that are falling for the same old polarization dialectic paradigm, in my experience, are the people that have zero knowledge of the occult, and they want to scoff at it and they want to make fun of it, like the engineers want to laugh at the psychologists. But who's laughing now? Because now you don't have any freedom, basically, and you might have made a lot of money doing some engineering work, but what good's that going to do you if you're not allowed to go anywhere and spend it? So, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. That hence the word occult.
It's kind of inevitable to point out at the current situation, because it's what clearer example of a population that it's incomplete, let's say, again, ignorance about its own psyche, and how this is being used to further this absurd story of just as a pretext to gain pretty much complete power in their intentions. So, and there's no clearer example than the whole COVID agenda and health dictatorship, so to speak. So
yeah, and I'll say something about that. A government's dream and the struggle between people trying to keep the power or at least have influence in affairs of the state. Part of that struggle has always been the government wanting to treat its citizens as basically guilty until proven innocent. So the people's struggle for power has been a struggle to protect their innocence until proven guilty. And that's always been kind of the jiving paradigm between people trying to have influence with affairs of the state. So yeah, this medical tyranny that we're experiencing is the perfect catalyst for government to abuse its power and have draconian policy and massive overreach. There's actually a medical term we can use to describe this. It's called MSBP, which is Munchausen syndrome by proxy. That's where you treat somebody who's healthy as though they're a sick person. And it has a placebo as well. So we want to keep that in mind. In other words, if you treat somebody like they're sick when they're actually, in fact, not sick, you could actually make them sick by doing that. Or if you put somebody in like a hospital environment that's perfectly healthy, they could become ill just by seeing things that stoke in their mind, you know, medical conditions or medical emergencies. It definitely has a placebo. And, you know, but the point is, you don't treat healthy people like sick people, and you don't treat innocent people like guilty people. And that's been the dream of every totalitarian regime. And we should know better. It's like, even if they actually did care about our health, it's still entirely way too dangerous to hand man that much power, because that's far more dangerous than any potential virus ever could be. And we're all mature enough to know and understand that. So seeing people act like this thing can be trusted and that they have our best interest in mind, it's very horrifying to see it happening, because it really shows you where people's heads are at. And it shows you how powerful the mind control is. And that's what we have to deal with, is the mind control, because mind control is what controls this planet. And we can call that religion, in the sense that it's religion, in the sense that it's an erroneous belief system that's holding us back from developing true conscious awareness and expanding conscious with the true force of love, which we can call agape, which is expanding our consciousness. So we want to be careful with this Munchausen by proxy. And we also want to be careful, you know, not to say anything here that's going to get our podcast censored off of the internet, because we got to get this information out to people. So we got to be able to do this in such a way that we can fly this under the radar and still keep it, you know, on point. It's a difficult prospect.
We were talking about hiding knowledge, right? So I guess we can, because one thing I wanted to ask you was actually about secret societies, and sort of the reasons for, you know, why do people, you know, formed or gathered or, you know, founded secret societies. Because again, as we said, there was like a double sort of, we sort of answered this already, but it goes with the whole, you know, with the fact that some knowledge needed to be hidden for good, either for good reasons, to preserve it, or to avoid it being eradicated, or for bad reasons. So I mean, what's the deal with secret societies? Like, because again, people think they are all, you know, that's what's in control now. Secret societies, you know, we could open the whole Freemasonry controversy, I guess. You know, people tend to think that, you know, secret societies is what's in control of what's dominating the world right now. but I think we have to again give a little bit of context in regards of our past and the reason why they were established. I don't know if it was all, if the reasons were all nefarious or not, or you know.
Yeah, I understand the dilemma with that subject. I'm still trying to answer on the occult.
Yeah.
I'm going to address that question. But you know, part of what is also part of the occult world is lost history and lost science and lost knowledge, also lost chronology. And I already mentioned knowledge from which religions were derived, also lost expressions of lost knowledge. And another thing about the occult and understanding the occult is pretty much what I would consider the first criteria for enlightenment. So the idea of a secret society, yeah, dealing with the word secrecy, you know, because part of the confusion about secret societies is the very concept of the idea of secrecy. For instance, we were talking about esoteric knowledge. A lot of what some people would call a secret is really only, in fact, esoteric. So that is to say that even if the dark sorcerers of this world came out of the shadows and showed people the body of knowledge that they were working with, how they were running the operation, and opened the vaults to the Vatican or whatever, that knowledge would be useless to people that don't want truth. And that's what we're going to find. People don't want truth because it's not, I mean, it's going to be an obstacle for their materialistic ambition in many cases. So even if you gave them that truth, they wouldn't have enough knowledge to be able to understand it, or they wouldn't be willing to put in the time and attention that it would take to learn what it is about it that needs to be understood. So it's not just a matter of secrecy. It's also a matter of ignorance, which is an act of sheer willpower. You know, the fact that people don't really understand the working forces in this world is not because somebody hid knowledge from them. In the 21st century, in the age of information, the ignorance is the measure of a bad person. Ignorance is the measure of somebody who doesn't care about truth, because it's an act of sheer willpower. So the fact that they want to entertain the idea that somebody's hiding something from them, I'm not saying that's not the case. The knowledge was hidden for good reasons and for bad reasons through time. But if we haven't been using the internet since its inception to edify ourselves, we're drastically behind the curve. And we need to consider that the truth essentially has been revealed. We're living in a post-apocalyptic world where the truth is available to us. And if we don't understand it, it's probably because we're not allocating good use for our spiritual currencies, which are time and attention. But yeah, secret societies, ideally, they would have originally formed as a contingency for lost knowledge. But as the knowledge, at the point where the knowledge began to become corrupted, and then man wanted to engage in socialism and set up socialism, which is man's law, then we're going to have the phenomenon of man hiding knowledge for personal materialistic ambition. And that's a whole new ballgame. And we have to understand that the secret societies, without them, the knowledge that we need to penetrate the pre-Christian world and to understand the lost expression of the lost true science would be already eradicated from the planet if it wasn't for the functions of the secret societies. So it's in the interest of the controlling classes to marginalize any culture or any organization, especially educational organization, that's teaching anything outside of its controlled paradigm. They want to force you onto one book and only have you learning from their book, from their appointed authorities, they call their priests or what have you. But the main thing is they want to control what you can learn and how you can learn it. So we have to understand when we see other cultures being marginalized, especially in the pre-Christian world. For instance, the idea that the Incas were engaged in human sacrifice, and that the idea that they had built the Mexican pyramids so they could drag people up the stairs of the pyramids and murder them as a human sacrifice with an obsidian blade. You have to understand, key bono, who stands to gain from that? Well, if Rome is launching an imperial campaign to decimate the Inca people, the first thing they're going to do is infiltrate that culture and marginalize the culture. That will bolster their campaign to decimate that society. So they're masters of assimilating the culture and then injecting the culture with things that would seemingly be, you know, nefarious, or of dark origins, or just, you know, evil behavior or bad behavior. Any way they can marginalize anything, let's say in this case, non-Christian, will bolster their campaign to decimate it. And I think that needs to be the first and foremost concern before we ever even want to entertain the notion that culture from the pre-Christian world is somehow primitive, because I think that's a huge logical fallacy. And it's so easy to convince people with fear that you need to be afraid of something that you don't understand. You know, I mean, the idea that we're going to marginalize Freemasons. First of all, we wouldn't want to confuse what is in Freemasonry with people that have joined into the Masonic Lodge system, just the same as we wouldn't want to confuse what Christianity actually is with people who actually go to church, because they're not the same. You know, what most people that do consider themselves Christians, they have a completely vestigial, watered down, politically correct version of Christianity that bolsters the status quo. So they don't have the exoteric doctrine of Christianity, and yet they still think they're Christians. Well, the same thing happens in Freemasonry, and it's even less understood. But the difference is that Freemasonry had to operate under the radar of Latin Christendom because it would have been accused of heresy. But if were it not for Freemasonry and the other secret societies that emerged post-Renaissance, the knowledge that we need to undo this dilemma would not even be available to us now. So we have to understand, yes, the brick and mortar institutions, like all institutions, as soon as they become above ground, above sub rosa, they're infiltrated and stigmatized, and the teachings are the teachings are corrupted and brought out into the light of day as corrupted teachings to stigmatize the image of the institution, which bolsters the campaign against it. And that has to be understood. The institution is not the teaching. You know, so if you have a secret society and you want to conduct clandestine operations, yeah, what better place to do it, you know, to go into this secret club and we can have all these, you know, clandestine, discreet conversations amongst ourselves about our evil plans to take over the world. And we can do it in plain sight under the guise of operating in a secret society, at the same time simultaneously marginalizing the integrity of secret societies, which are the only last line of defense against the campaign of the Latin Christendom and the Roman Church. People are already afraid of things that they don't understand. And as I said, the dark occultists, one of their main techniques is dissuasion. So all they have to do to dissuade you from looking into the information that we don't understand is to stigmatize it by associating it with devil worshiper or devil worshiping, and giving you this Hollywood variant of what Satanism is. And people associate basically at that point anything non-Christian as, you know, a bunch of psychotic teenagers going into the woods and sacrificing animals to the dark lord or something.
Yeah.
And that's the whole trick of the dark occultists. They don't want you to know that what real Satanism is simply basically selfishness and materialism. And, you know, materialistic ambition is really what Satanism is, because that's what causes us to engage in behavior that sells out our brothers and sisters to the slave system that we call man's law. And it bolsters the idea of the legitimacy of man's law. You know, so everything that the dark forces in this world are endeavoring to do is to bolster man's law, or man's claim to the Most High, man's authority. So they want to marginalize anything that is self-empowering, anything that it allows you to discover the actual natural laws that exist in nature. They just want to dissuade you from discovering that. They don't want you to have prudence, because without prudence, you can't discover the boundaries of the natural law. So they want to, you know, for instance, outlaw vice. So by outlawing vice, you can't have prudence, and you can never discover man's law without vice, or natural law without vice. So by marginalizing and outlawing vice, they can buffer you off from ever be able to discover natural law. So that's part of it. And but
And
these yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was saying, demonize natural law itself, obfuscating it with the law of the jungle, and the kind of the just pure animalistic brutality, so
That's right. And when people hear that word natural, they automatically want to associate that with Darwinian theory. The idea that if a lion takes a gazelle down on the plains, that's perfectly a natural function of nature. So we should be able to do that too. They don't understand that these natural laws that we're discussing don't apply to beings that operate on pure instinct. They only apply to beings that have the capacity to understand the difference between right action and wrong action. So as long as we have ambiguity regarding property, we're going to have ambiguity regarding how we understand what a human right is. And if we don't understand what a human right is, we can't understand what a wrong is. So we really need to clear up this ambiguity concerning this word property. And once we enter into the corporate world, property becomes so ambiguous, it's impossible to put a finer point on it. And then that opens the door for moral relativism, which opens the door for social Darwinism. It's all driven in the first place from Jump Street by selfish materialistic ambition, and ultimately results in a eugenics mindset. So I would tell you, anybody, whether they want to admit it or not, if they believe in man's law or they believe in man's authority, are a eugenicist, whether they know it or not. And what's more, I'd say a dysgenicist, because they're not only interested in breeding, better breeding, they're interested in determining who should be allowed to breed, or who should be even allowed to live, and when they're allowed to live, and when they're allowed to die. And we have to understand all of the ramifications of that, because it's a very dangerous prospect.
Yes, yes, indeed. And so you talked about property and materialism. So I wonder if you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, like the main point I'm trying to make is rights are based on property rights, but we have to be able to truly define what ownership actually is in fact. And it's a big subject, and it's a difficult subject, but basically at this point, let's just try to define what a right is, which would be an action that does not cause harm to another sentient being. So any action that was taken by a person that has the mental capacity to know that they've caused harm to another sentient being, if they take an action that does cause that harm, then that would absolutely be not a right. So that would be a wrong. And we can discover what rights are. We could never list all of our rights because it's infinite, but we can discover what rights are by understanding what rights are not. And we can do that through the process of apophysis. By understanding what a right is not, we can arrive at what a right is. And a right we can define as any action that does not cause harm to another sentient being. So transgressions against natural law essentially would be murder, rape, trespass, assault, theft, coercion, and lying are transgressions against natural law, which means that basically any one of those actions does cause harm to another sentient being. So we can discover what a right is by understanding that those are not rights. Essentially, anything else that does not cause harm to another sentient being is, in fact, a right. But again, until we can put a finer point on property, we have ambiguity surrounding this term. And maybe we can do that on a future show and try to come in here and put a finer point on property. But I want to keep going with this subject for today.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no problem.
Because it's involved, and it's going to be another, long show when we get into that. But yeah, I mean, my concerns are what makes it hard for people to understand natural law. And then, of course, anything that would make it difficult for people to accept it and come to terms with it. So let's just keep talking about the occult. Let me give the definition for the occult. The occult is a body of science which is not widely known to the general population, consisting of hidden knowledge about the workings of the human psyche and the laws of nature, both seen physical laws and unseen spiritual laws, the laws that govern morality and behavioral consequences of sentient beings with the capacity to know the difference between right and wrong. So we're talking about natural law. What two bodies of knowledge does the occult hide? Well, typically, what we can call the minor arcana meaning knowledge, and the major arcana. So the minor arcana is knowledge of self, and then the major arcana is the knowledge of the environment in which the self operates. You can also call the minor arcana or the lesser arcana and the greater arcana would be the same as the minor arcana and the major arcana. Minor arcana dealing with microcosm, knowledge of self, and major arcana dealing with macrocosm, the knowledge of the environment in which the self operates. So essentially, those are the two bodies of knowledge that are the most occulted. And we have to understand why that is, because we're talking about man's ambition to become the lawmaker. So part of that modus operandi is going to be to obscure or dissuade us from looking into or understanding the natural law. And in occultism, there is light occultism, as we've been discussing. So light occultism has an objective of natural law principles at its foundation, and a concern with alignment of the aspects of consciousness as its goal. So light occultism, its ambition is to align our thoughts, emotions, and action, to have balance in our thoughts and our emotions, which results in a manifested right action in the world. And mysticism should not be really confused with occultism. Mysticism is kind of like an introduction to the occult, but ultimately mysticism typically finds the limitation and ultimately can amount to nothing more than an exoteric religion. So, one way I could describe mysticism is like a base camp where everybody pitched their tent on the journey. It's kind of they went partially up the mountainside of consciousness and pitched their tent, and it's a base camp, but it becomes an exoteric religion in that way. And we should be able to discern that from occult knowledge, because occult represents a wider body of science. It deals with all of the existing laws in nature. And our concern is in light occultism is how we can align with those bodies or with those laws in nature. And that occult knowledge is neither good nor bad. It's like a double-edged sword. It's all based on the wielder of the knowledge and what their intent with that knowledge is. It's a tool. So when we get into magic versus sorcery, magic could be defined as the self-empowerment that we're discussing about light occultism, to align our thoughts, emotions, and action. And then the opposite of that would be, we could call sorcery or dark occultism, where we're trying to use the forces in nature by, and dissuading people from them and our materialistic ambition to control. So what part of the lesson is, an ambition to control, and the extent is typically driven by an action based in fear. And any action based in fear results in chaos. So man's ambition to control is resulting in chaos because it's an action that initiated in fear.
Yes.
So therefore, the manifested result is chaos. And we want to call it order, but it's really chaos. And these are some of the things that I wanted to try to get to when we were having this discussion.
Yeah, no, that's right. Fear brings this desire to control. So ultimately, it's what leads to more chaos instead of more order. But yeah, that's what we are trying to explain to those who are willing to listen.
Yeah, religious beliefs drive the system of slavery on earth, and people's thinking on it is, I don't need to look into the occult because I don't believe in that stuff.
Yeah.
And that is a very ignorant position to be coming from, because that's, let me say this too. So part of the modus operandi of the status quo, or the ruling class, is to stigmatize anything that is outside of their control. So part of what they do is they create extremists in any other tradition. So, you see it happening today. Let's say like with Islam extremism. Well, Islam extremism, or the idea of Islam extremism, marginalizes Islam. At the same time, that bolsters other religions, particularly Christianity. So if we're marginalizing Islam, then that can be a recruitment drive for Christianity. We can get more people signing up for Christianity by marginalizing Islam. That's just an example of what I'm trying to say. So we see it happening in our world today. So the idea is of a controlling paradigm based in man's law or man's authority always has an interest in marginalizing anything that they don't have control over. And they do that by creating extremists. When we're talking about truth, you have to understand truth by its very nature. It's extreme because it wages war on mind control. It wages war on the lie. that is man's law. However, we have to understand that it's in a controlling class's interests to create extremism in any other tradition that they can't control, because they can use that to marginalize the tradition and then bolster a campaign against it. So partly what I'm saying is a lot of these strange perversions or strange traditions that we find are traditions that have deteriorated over time and then ultimately were infiltrated and corrupted deliberately to bring that out into the light of day and bolster a campaign against it. And that's what the controlling classes that rule this world are masters of. They understand that. They understand how to manipulate the psyche and use fear as a stigma to stigmatize anything that they don't control the narrative in. So I'm just trying to put a lot of emphasis on that because it's hard to explain. I don't know if I'm doing a good job, but
it's I think so.
Yeah, that's something we got to really understand, because I still see us getting fooled by it. Because the terminology is confusing. We get stuck on these words like socialism.
Yes.
Socialism is only part of a greater mental disease, and this idea of capitalism is part of that same mental disease. So this capitalism, people think that's the only failsafe for communism. In fact, they don't understand that capitalism is the anvil and socialism or communism is the hammer of a political paradigm dialectic that's used to implement totalitarianism. So if we're embracing this idea of capitalism, which is really just materialistic ambition, it's social Darwinism to get a leg up on our fellow humans. So it is not a political solution. It's a spiritual solution, because as long as we're trying to get a leg up on our fellow humans, we're not trying to help our fellow humans. That means war, essentially. You've declared war on your brothers and sisters, because you want more milk in your glass, or you want a bigger piece of the pie, or whatever. It's the lowest possible expression that we, which is the highest beings on the planet, have engaged in. So if you have the highest beings on the planet engaged in the lowest possible expression, that's something less than animal, because we're not filling our role in nature, and we have the power to wield the forces over all of creation, essentially. So we have a tremendous responsibility not to act like children and not to think like children. And there's a million different ways I can say this. So my only concern is that I get enough of it on the table that people can really start to understand it. Because, the occult knowledge is just a tool, and it can be used for good or bad, but it's more than just a tool. It's actually our salvation. I'm not saying occult knowledge is our salvation, but knowledge that has been lost and has been occulted is knowledge that we will need to solve this problem.
All right, so we are back from a little break that we took, and we are back. We are ready to get back into action here, and I think we did a pretty good job in discussing the occult. We gave a pretty good overview of it. So I guess we can go on with the subjects that we wanted to discuss a little bit further. So Douglas, you can take it away.
Sure. Yeah, we were talking about the occult and what knowledge is hidden in the occult, which is primarily any knowledge that's self-empowering. So part of our dilemma here is man's law or man's authority. So part of the modus operandi is going to be to dissuade us from looking into true science. So we're asking, what knowledge is hidden in the occult. Part of that answer is true science. So it's all about the claim to the most high. Well, if they can hide the true science, then they can push their pseudoscience on us. And we have to understand the prospect. If we learn nothing else from Nuremberg, it taught us that every tyranny has the potential to begin as a medical tyranny, because it's about the claim to the most high. And when you're talking about a matter of life and death, it becomes imperative. So, it's not like in this country, we have the Constitution. Well, in the Constitution, there is no provision that says none of this matters if somebody gets a cold or gets the sniffles. So obviously this is being used to erode our freedoms or blatantly destroy our freedoms. And it's an undeniable fact that is potentially a far more dangerous prospect than any would be or said contagion.
Yeah, I guess they are not called inalienable rights for no reason. They're actually called, and this is what people seem to think about, but they're not called inalienable just to be violated whenever there's some kind of emergency, whether it's real or perceived or fake or natural or artificial. So
that's absolutely right. And that's where we get the idea of the republic. So let's talk about that for a minute.
Okay.
I want to try to explain these paradigms. The idea of a democracy is a Greek ideal. It comes from Greece. And the idea of a democracy, Greece represented, at the beginning of where our history picks up, it represents a departure from the old era, which was what we can call theocratic monarchy, which is a non-secular government system controlled by a doctrine of religion. So it's basically a theocratic monarchy. So the democracy that emerged in Greece emerged as a contingency for theocratic monarchy or tyranny. And or it was a failsafe for tyranny. And basically the system was designed they would vote and basically just vote on who to ostracize. So if anybody was a member of the political body and they didn't like their policies or they didn't like their modus operandi, they could be voted to be ostracized and exiled from Greece for a period of 10 years or something to that effect. So we have to understand that ideally the idea of a democracy is a dangerous prospect, because that means the most ignorant people in a mob, the ignorant people in a society influencing and having effect on affairs of the state. So democracy in itself essentially is a mob rule, and a mob rule or a democracy essentially means rule by the most ignorant. And that's a very dangerous prospect. So the idea of a republic, which is a Roman ideal, we know it goes further back. It comes from Babylon and the Code of Hammurabi, and probably even further back than that. But the idea of the republic is to enshrine inalienable or inalienable rights. And that constitutes an orthodoxy. So this is where the term conservative comes from. So the term conservative, typically it means orthodoxy. In this country, the United States, that typically means the Constitution is the orthodoxy, or defines the orthodoxy. So our country is based on an orthodoxy based on the Constitution. And the idea of the republic is it's the symbol of the fasci, which is the axe with the sticks bundled around it. That is a symbol that means a republic. And that's where we get the term fascism. So the idea of fascism is the extreme of a republic, where a republic or a government of the republic becomes totally in collusion with the corporate or with the corporations. And that's the collusion of the state and the corporations, and So fascism existed in the 40s, and it was a concern. You know, we've seen fascism before, but the difference now is when we first saw fascism in the 40s, the governments were still more powerful than the corporations. But see, now the corporations have become more powerful than the governments. So fascism is still the same prospect, and it's still happening. Only now the corporations have rose up and are more powerful than the governments. But it's still the same equation where you have collusion between the state and the government. So the main thing I'm trying to explain is a republic is, you know, where we have the need to have an imaginary boundary we call a state or a country. And inside that boundary, we protect that orthodoxy. That's our republic. And that's a contingency for democracy. And the structure of our government in this country, the United States, is considered to be or supposed to be de facto or have been set up as a democratic republic. So the idea is the republic enshrines and protects the inalienable rights, and then the democratic function allows average citizens to participate in affairs of the state without overthrowing their own inalienable rights through their own ignorance. That's the whole idea.
I don't know if it was quite a successful idea, but
well, so far it's proving not to be, because you know, less than 250 years from the initiation or institution of the Constitution in 1787. Look where we are today. Our freedoms are almost completely, utterly destroyed. And obviously it has not, you know, we've experienced the revisionism in the doctrine through the liberal ideal, which is associated with a democracy. You know, there's a lot more to it, because we have to understand the essential worldviews that underlie these types of political paradigms. Like the Greek ideal of democracy is based on seeing the entire world as a Greek, or you know, seeing the entire world as a citizen was a member of the entire world, not just a citizen of Greece. You see what I mean? So it's a more of a liberal ideal that's not trying to create a orthodoxy inside of a boundary. So the orthodoxy is represented by the term conservative, and then the liberal ideal is based on the idea of freedom, and comes from the Latin liber, which means also book.
Yes.
So that's, so that infers that our freedom is directly dependent on knowledge. But the main point I wanted to make about those terms, liberal and conservative, is the conservative means an orthodoxy in a republic, and the liberal is like open to interpretation. So the orthodox is by the book, or the conservative means by the book, and then liberal means open to interpretation. And that's where the revisionism comes from. But we also have to understand that liberal is a more freedom-oriented ideal, and the republic is potentially more inhibitive or prohibitive, because it potentially is going to be inclined to have more of a rigid set of rules. It's a polarization, or it becomes a polarization dialectic. And then once you're pulled into the dialectic, you can easily just play both groups off of against each other.
Yeah, because I think the polarization, the creation of this dialectic, ultimately benefits. No, we said cui bono, at the beginning. Ultimately, who benefits? Ultimately, it benefits the power structure, because you're gonna, as far as they as far as they've set it up, you're going to end up with authoritarianism, whether you are on the, let's say the conservative side of the spectrum, or whether you are on the so-called liberal, or more, let's say, so-called progressive or leftist or similar. I mean, the result is going to be, ultimately is going to be the same, but giving, coming from different directions, but the result is going to be, it's going to fuel this authoritarianism, basically.
That's right. I mean, it's been said government is a rich man's trick. And the trick is the polarization dialectic. So these ideals of conservatism and liberalism in this country are far removed from what they initially meant in their inception. So part of that's due to the degradation of language, or at least, what the Constitution actually defines or codifies has been marginalized also by the degradation of language, because our language has degraded almost to the point where it can even mean the exact opposite of its original meaning. So these terms, liberal and conservatism, are kind of far removed from what they had originally meant. So neoconservatism is not the same as classical conservatism, and neoliberalism is far removed from what I would call classical liberalism, if I said that right. So neoconservatism is not the same as classical conservatism, and neoliberalism is not the same as classical liberalism. And both of those ideals are very, very close to center in their classic, they're very close to center, because government was always seen as a fearful master and a dangerous servant by the founding fathers of this country.
Yeah.
So if anybody was left at all or right at all of center, they were very close to center, which means they were interested in minimum government. And obviously that was a mistake, because that's no longer the case. But, so it's like you don't play with fire. Ideally, it's not a political lesson. It's a spiritual lesson. Man is not God. Man is not the lawmaker. So it's going to be difficult to continue to justify man's law in any way, shape, or form. And the point about it is, we have no use for lost knowledge and spirituals as long as we embrace man's law. So as long as we're stuck in the axioms of any axiom that supports the idea of master-slave relationships, then we're straying from truth. We're straying from freedom.
Yeah.
Because ideally, the choices that you have are really freedom or slavery. So if we embrace man's law, we embrace slavery. If you choose to embrace man's authority, you've made your choice. You have embraced slavery. It doesn't matter if you understand that's what it is.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter the sort of the level, it's
yeah, because if you experienced a period of peace and prosperity under man's law by embracing that choice, I promise you it was temporary, it was short-lived, and it's over now. So if it was ever doing you any good in the past, open your eyes. Them days are over. It was simply temporary to get you to where you are now. And it's going to be very, very difficult, if it's even possible, to get out of the situation that we are now, which means we should have learned in the first place never to let it come to this, because once you get into this situation, you may never be able to get yourself out of it. So I want to put the emphasis on never letting it come to this, by knowing in the first place that man's law is inevitably corrupt, and it's always going to lead you to the same place. Because if we don't proactively avoid trying to embrace man's law, we may find ourselves in a situation where we can't get out of this slavery. And the whole point is never let it come to this, to value those spiritual principles in the first place before they get trampled in the mud and squandered and lost in history, is what I'm trying to say. And let me go ahead and just say a little bit more. So part of the problem with the mysticism is it's a type of magical thinking. And I equate the mysticism as a type of exoteric religion. And I want to talk about these ideals that really are underlying the socialist mindset, the mindset that wants to embrace man's law and understand it's an action based in fear. Go ahead.
No, just one thing to clarify for people. What you're talking about, when you say socialism, it's outside, something outside of what, the outside of the paradigm that people are used to these days.
Yes.
So basically, you say socialism is pretty much government, every form of, man's, every form of government, basically every form of man's law. So
that's right.
Okay.
That's right. Okay. Typically we hear the word socialism. I think most people associate that with Bolshevism.
Yes.
And then Lenin's rise to power at the overthrowing of the Romanov dynasty, and then ultimately the rise of Soviet communism. So they typically, I think we could say, they see socialism as a lesser form or a mild form of communism. And I think that most people associate communism with the complete abolition of private property. And then therefore they associate capitalism as the only fail-safe for communism. And that's where we're making our mistake, because ideally, in our ideas about capitalism, we still have centralized control of the resources. So part of understanding the danger of it is understanding how the power consolidates, how the shrine of the republic is marginalized and ultimately diminished. But the point about it is, as long as you have any form of centralized control of resources and a coercive government, that is not true capitalism. And that's not laissez-faire capitalism. It's crony capitalism. And it's really just going to amount to expediting socialism, which would ultimately snowball into communism. So I consider it to be a fast track to socialism rather than a contingency for it, because ideally, like I say, it's not a political lesson, it's a spiritual lesson. We have to learn that all of these paradigms based on man's law are flawed from their onset, because man is not the lawmaker. And man's law is based in, first of all, materialistic ambition, followed by moral relativism must be embraced, which leads to social Darwinism, the need to have a leg up on our fellow humans, and ultimately eugenics, which means deciding who gets to live and who gets to die, or when they get to live and when they get to die. So these are the tenets of what some people consider to be Satanism. And I don't want to get confused in the terminology, but I do want to point out that the status quo has spent a great deal of resources trying to convince us and sell us this idea that Satanism is a form of devil worship for the archetypal Christian devil, because that's how they dissuade you from understanding that Satanism is really nothing more than personal materialistic ambition and selfishness. So we have to outgrow these paradigms of man's law, because they constitute moral relativism. And moral relativism is going, be right or go wrong. It's you're straying from truth. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, exactly. As I was saying, moral relativism is one of the serious and true illnesses that are afflicting the human population right now. So
Yeah. So, the government's modus operandi always is to keep the moral high ground. So it tries to create an image of itself, the veneer or the facade, and everything. Okay, a government's only means to any end is violence. So that in itself is immoral, or it's an immoral prospect. But for the government to justify the violence that it takes, it's endeavoring to keep the moral high ground and control the narrative. It's its primary directive. So the primary directive is to control the narrative, and then by doing so, it can maintain the image of keeping the moral high ground. We can call that the velvet glove, that facade. And that's what most of the resources are used for, is to create an image of the government that's not really true, a slanted veneer of the image of what it really is. So as if we start to resist the government, then it has to start to pull that velvet glove off of that iron fist and show you the real mechanism behind that power, which is that iron fist of coercive control. And the more the glove comes off, the more people can see it. And then the more people are inclined to stand up and resist it. And then it comes off even more. So the velvet glove coming off of the iron fist is part of this phenomenon. They don't want you to see them for who they are. They don't want you to know that their only means to any end is violence, and that's immoral. That's my dog howling. But that's what I'm trying to tell you. And I know I'm preaching to the choir with a lot of this stuff, but so we have to understand anything that creates master-slave relationships is potentially harmful in this world, and that includes money, because money does create master-slave relationships, and you can't serve two masters, God and mammon, both mammon being money or government, because man is not the lawmaker. And so the dilemma that we have is the collective against the individual. And what we have to understand, for instance, I would tell you that in this country, the Constitution was designed to protect inalienable rights for the individual.
Yes.
Which means once they set up this party system in this country, they had already violated their own Constitution, because a party represents a group, and nothing in the Constitution is designed to protect a group, because a group doesn't have rights. A group can't have rights. So having these political parties already violate the Constitution, because the Constitution does not protect political parties, because groups do not have rights.
Yeah, you strike a chord there with me, because I'm seeing how different this is seen. The difference that there is from, let's say, the US or a part of people in the US, and how, and the mindset here, the European mindset is, you really see, I mean, they did a pretty good job here of equating individualism with selfishness and egoism. And the mindset here is it's mostly collectivist. Even in, let's say, people who are opposing, for example, what's going on right now, or are critical of the government, but I'm seeing, from what I'm seeing, it's clear that the mindset remains mainly collectivist, and that's what that's also why I'm kind of trying to do what I'm doing, to get these ideas, these ideas about what you were talking about just now about the individual, about the individual rights, the importance of individual rights, because as you said, the group or the collective in the end, in the end, what is it? It's many individuals, and if the rights of and if you start establishing a sort of a difference, these are individual rights and these are collective rights. I think we are already going towards disaster, to be honest.
Absolutely, because there is no such thing as collective rights. There are only individual rights.
Yeah, and that's not selfish. That's not egoistical. That's garbage. That's propaganda. That's how you've been taught by your authoritarian statist socialist professor. But it's not true. It's not the way it is. So
yeah, Antonio Gramsci's long march through the cultural institutions.
Exactly. Very successful. It has been very successful.
Absolutely, it has in the Fabian Society. Let me give you a Nietzsche quote regarding all this. Nietzsche said, "The state is the coldest of all cold monsters. Coldly, it tells lies. From its lips, it whispers, 'I, the state, am the people.'" That's the lie. You have the illusion of control. You do not have control. You do not even have influence in affairs of the state. You have a polarization, political manipulation dialectic that is moving us rapidly towards totalitarianism on either side, because it's a spiritual lesson. Man, since no men are angels, none are fit to rule. Man's law is arbitrary. Man's law is ambiguous. Man's law is biased, therefore it cannot be just, it cannot be fair. And I can go on and on. I could go on a tirade here. But
if you want to, yeah, go.
Yeah, it's the
Go
most
ahead.
deplorable ideology, and we're supposed to be the highest expression of a being in this world, engaged in the lowest expression of our potential. That makes us something less than animal, embracing man's law, and that attracts the most degenerated. It's garbage for the soul, and it attracts garbage to it. People that want authority, people that want to dominate other people, are what are attracted to it. And if we learn nothing else from Nuremberg, we learned that order following is never a virtue, because a stronger state is not a virtue. And the Machiavellian, the end justifies the means, because the emperors were concerned about having patriotic forces to avoid becoming too dependent on mercenary forces, where they could be overthrown by the generals. So they wanted to promote ideals of nationalism, to promote nationalistic fervor, to have a nationalistic patriotic army, so the emperor would not be in danger of being overthrown by the generals' mercenary forces. And then the idea of a government modus operandi is the end justifies the means, and the means is virtue is redefined by anything that leads to a stronger state.
Obedience, blind obedience. And
I'm talking about, in the idea of man's law, virtue becomes redefined as that which leads to a stronger state, in favor of the collective.
Yeah.
And I'm telling us that that's a fallacy, because order following cannot be a virtue, because you're abdicating the exercise of your own conscience to know the difference between right and wrong. So people that want to gravitate to statism, to socialism, to man's law, are people that want to abdicate their responsibility to truth, because they've become demoralized. They've become dehumanized.
Yeah, and they are, but in today's mindset, all this is super. Even if people are, even if some people might be aware of it, all this is superseded by the need for materialistic gains, the need for, materialism,
Right.
basically. So
that's right.
so
And
that's-
ultimately, we are selling our soul for convenience,
Yeah.
is what it'll come down to. That's why we see people hoarding toilet paper, because part of the spiritual lesson is we actually are selling our soul for convenience, and the end justifies the means. And that's, there's a huge backstory that we can get into in another show maybe, but to really understand that, we have to understand culture. To really understand what's driving the human behavior, we have to understand not just culture, but origins of the ideas. Because, for instance, the farther we stray from our natural habitat, which is actually no more than 15 degrees north or south of the equator, the more we need or rely on utility. So the farther we go from our natural habitat, the more we need, we can't grow crops year round. So we become more reliant on carnism. We need food and shelter to stay warm, fire, the farther we stray from our natural habitat, the more we are forced into utility. And then that leads to ideals like Roman pragmatism. And the problem with Roman pragmatism is it leaves morality at the door. So it's always about the most practical way to do something, but not necessarily the most moral way to do it. So if they want to lay down a railroad track, it's going through your living room. The practical way to do it is just lay down the tracks, but that's not moral. And another thing with Roman pragmatism is it promotes the idea of believing in master-slave relationships. But, let me finish my point about Nuremberg. Taught us that order following is not a virtue. And that, therefore, that means a stronger state or the interest of the collective is not a virtue. Because again, a collective represents a group, and a group does not have rights. Only the individual has rights. So order following is a deplorable ideology, and government is a deplorable ideology. It's garbage for the soul, and it attracts garbage, which are people that want to abdicate their personal responsibility to truth and just do what somebody else tells them without thinking, and never exercise their own consciousness to know the difference between true right action over wrong action. In regard to the occult, another aspect, we did talk a little bit about secret societies, but in the occult, we do have the occult traditions, and typically those are Freemasonry, Kabbalah, tarot, and alchemy.
Yeah.
But then there's many others, but those are the primaries. And I think we've, like I say, the knowledge of the subject of the occult is a vast subject, and the subject of secret societies is a vast subject, and political paradigms and understanding what socialism really is a vast subject. But ideally, I will tell you that any form of man's law or coercive government is a form of socialism. And that means coercive control. So ideally, the utopian dream of capitalism is a fallacy, because it's just another path to totalitarianism. And we have to understand why that's true. We have to understand that ideally, based on what we see happening in America today, that we can see that it does, there's enough ambiguity in it. It's going to take us down the path of totalitarianism. So it was a novel idea, but the novelty wore off. This idea of the democratic republic, it was a novel idea based on man's law. Man's law was a fallacy. The novelty wore off. The great legislator of today is the forgotten failure of tomorrow, because man is not the lawmaker. Man is not God. And that's what we have to learn. And then we have to learn to care about each other. So we got a lot of work to do, and it's going to require a lot of knowledge to get it done. We all fell for it, so we don't need to feel bad about it. Personally, I really didn't, but it took a long time to learn how it works. And I never really understood it until I applied myself to trying to learn and understand. And it takes a great deal of work and a great deal of research. And the sooner everybody gets started, the better off we're going to be. And we don't really have any time to waste. But there's a lot more to all of these subjects, and especially regarding the occult, we can only just be barely scratching the surface. But I'm hoping that I get to come back on here with you in the near future and further flesh these topics out with you, Francisco, because I think I'm very amazed by your level of knowledge. And, you know, I got a few years on you, so I can't really even imagine what it would like to have your level of knowledge at your young age. And that's very impressive, and it's very refreshing. And that's part of my hope for the future, is people like yourself that are taking an interest and taking the time to learn and understand.
Well, yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. And yeah, but there's not many there's not many people who are sort of taking that time to understand this stuff. Yeah, we have to do our best, I guess, to give testimony, as I say, leave testimony of this type of knowledge and of these truths. If we have do we have time for I wanted to ask you something, because I remembered something you said on I've watched one of your presentations, and I think it was the real history of the French Revolution, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember if it's there when you sort of talk about this, the thing that I was mentioning before, the difference in the mindset we see today with the more collectivist idea being more spread in especially like in Europe, as opposed to, let's say, the places like the US, for example, where you have a bigger part of the population that at least has a comprehension of individual, of more the individual rights.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me, but I think I understand what you're getting at. Basically, I'm getting that you're saying that many of the people in Europe seem to have embraced the collective mindset, and that I had talked about things in my second presentation that had led up to the ideals for freedom that I ideally led up to the founding of this country we call America.
Yeah.
And how the Magna Carta had been a part of that. It's I can explain this in a reasonable amount of time. The first thing I would say is that we have to understand that from the onset of the Council of Nicaea, the ambition was to unite all of the unconquered regions in Europe, including England, under the banner of Latin Christendom. And that we have to understand that the older cultures, whether they were vestigial, which in most cases they are, still represent a strong ideological resistance to the Christendom doctrine. And it is the strong culture that put up the resistance that allowed it to exist and stay in existence long enough to survive into the modern world, which otherwise it would not have. And that's what I'm trying to tell you. So it was the cultures that were farther in the north were more resilient because they were more robust people, because they lived in a more hostile climate. But it was ideally the stronger culture that their forefathers were passing down from generation to generation, while in most cases largely vestigial, still represented a resilience to the Christendom doctrine. So it's important to understand that the history in Europe, in continental Europe, is different than the history in continental England. And the primary difference is this: in England, or in Europe, it's the absolute power of the king, which means the king's authority is completely unquestioned and there is no power that resides anywhere else. So if the king pleads fealty to the church, then he's bringing all his subjects into fealty to the church. So the king is only required that the king swears his allegiance to the church, and then all of his subjects are brought under the authority of the church. But because England, they shared power between the throne and the powerful land barons, we can call the nobility or the aristocracy, there's a balance of power sharing that is shared. And because of that, the Roman church had to do more than just gain the fealty of the king, because they wanted to make England a papal fief and they wanted to make the king a vassal of the church. But they couldn't do that because the balance was shared with the land barons. And that's what the Magna Carta was about. It was about striking that, or getting a doctrine that codified that balance of power, which was the laws of the old kings of England before the 1066 invasion of the Norman kings. But the main thing is, because they shared the power, that's part of the only reason that the knowledge that we need to get out of the throngs of the Roman church survived into the modern world, via the secret societies, which it otherwise would not have. So understanding that difference between the English power structure is very important, because it's only because they had to share the balance of power that it made it more difficult for Rome to make the king a vassal of the church, thus making England a papal fief or a land grant. So we have to understand that's the only reason this knowledge, this self-empowering knowledge, even has survived into the modern world today. And then your question about that is
yeah, that's kind of what that was what I was asking, that this can perhaps help people understand the sort of even the mindset even today. There are populations that are, as we are seeing even right now, there are populations who have been subjected more easily, and populations that have been where this is where the agenda has not been implemented so easily, like the states. And for example, is what you said, what you explained, that can perhaps be an explanation of this, also of this aspect of this kind of difference in how people react to purely authoritarian dictates.
Yeah, because I consider that particular knowledge of the different histories between continental Europe and England potentially in the realm of the occult, because they don't want you to know about that. They don't want you to know that there is knowledge that they wanted to get rid of that they haven't managed to fully get rid of yet. And that knowledge will paint a picture of the pre-Christian world that will help us better understand our individual sovereignty. And until we understand our individual sovereignty and respect our own rights, we can't respect the rights of others. So until we embrace and respect and take responsibility for our own sovereignty and our own ability to protect and defend ourselves, then we're opening the door for tyranny or slavery. Because if we're going to try to abdicate the responsibility to be responsible for our own protection, then we're going to cross the Rubicon and introduce a standing army into our midst. And that constitutes a far greater danger than any potential exterior threat. You know, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he brought the army into Rome, which is the same as basically saying you're putting the Senate under siege. And so if you have a standing army in your midst in the form of police or military or anything that's prepared to use violence to enforce decrees of the state, you are essentially are under siege, being held under duress. And anything that anybody does at that point is essentially an adverse reaction to duress. You know, so have to understand that these are serious subjects, and while we want to believe, you know, in some of these paradigms, we ultimately are intelligent enough to understand that ultimately it is a fallacy, and that we've got to quit believing in our own lies, or our, you know, we got to learn how to be honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
And understand the psychology behind cognitive dissonance and denial. It goes deep. It goes all the way back to our true origins, and it goes all the way back to our parenting and our parents' parenting, and generations after generations. We are in this human condition, and this is not our human nature. You know, this is a human condition. Our human nature is that we're programmable. We put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. So our education system is flawed, and we're teaching garbage, therefore we're getting garbage output. We're not inherently good, we're not inherently bad. That's not our human nature. Our human nature is we're programmable like a computer, and bad information in is going to get bad output out. So these are all factors, and it's a big subject. So I'm hoping I'm bringing some clarity to it.
Yeah, so I guess on this note, we are reaching the 2-hour mark here. So what do you say? We leave it here for now, and you know, hopefully do another show sometime. You can come back and talk a bit more on these topics, on some of these things.
Yeah, Francesco, that sounds great to me. I really loved coming on your show here and having a chance to talk about some of this stuff. And I'm really, really pleased to find out that you're taking an interest in my work, and just giving me this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I'm really glad that you're part of the One Great Work Network. And I you know, like I say, we can wrap this now because these are huge subjects. And
yeah,
hopefully we can, hopefully I can get back on here. You can come on our show on the Cubbyhole, and we can continue discussing these subjects. But I think these are the most important subjects that that need to be dealt with today. And anybody wants to look further into my work, you can find me at thecubbyhole.com and at the One Great Work Network. And I know Francesco also has work on the One Great Work Network, so you want to check us out there. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come on your show and have this discussion with you. So
yeah, absolutely. It's been a great discussion. Yeah, we hope to have, you know, whet the appetite of a few people, at least to, you know, start going to look go looking into it further, because as you said, it's the most important. These are the most important things that can actually, you know, one day, we don't know when, but they can actually pull us out of this mess that we've gotten ourselves into. So again, thanks, Douglas. So again, for everybody who's interested, go to the www.cubbyhole.com. It's the website, the place to go. And you also have a podcast. There's also a podcast in there made by, you know, there's Nate Kapp, Brandon Martin, and yourself are the hosts. So yeah, if you understand English, yeah, definitely start listening to that in order from episode 1 onwards. And yeah, that said, thanks again, and see everybody next time.